I mean, unless you can really carry your voice.
And I've got to repeat the question too.
Right. Right. And another thing is, we have I'm going to see if I can find somebody to do the lights for us. I wanted to start off a little bit with kind of thinking about what Watchable Wildlife is about and the objectives to Watchable Wildlife. And there's a number of them, of course. We can think about, promoting kind of enhanced opportunities for viewing of wildlife, fish, plants. Another objective is certainly about the enhanced learning opportunities. And the last one is really giving kind of a general public support for the long-term maintenance and conservation of our ecosystems for plants and animals. And that's specifically what I think Ray will be discussing this afternoon. And that is, again, getting that broad support, specifically through unique communities. And so many of the case studies that he'll be referring to are associated with the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Ray Raskers is an economist, a resource economist working for the Wilderness Society, and he also is employed by Montana State University as an adjunct lecturer. And with that, Ray, I welcome you.
Thank you.
And,
Okay. I think what I'll do is I'll start off right away with the slides. And I'm so wired up here, I think I might trick. I don't watch out. And if somebody could hit the lights for me in back. And I just messed this up. Okay. Is that in focus and visible for everybody? Tell me if it's not. I don't have the best eyes. I can't always judge whether it's in focus. So it's a little low. Maybe while I'm talking, if you want to put another book under it. What I want to do in this presentation is I want to illustrate the importance of wildlands and wildlife from an economic perspective. What does it mean for rural communities? What I want to do is, first of all, we're using here a case study, and this is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I'll be giving you first, through my slides, a little bit of background on the area. Where is the ecosystem? What type of critters do we have there? And what are some of the issues in the ecosystem? We have a lot of complicated issues that are going on. And then what I'd like to do, through a series of case studies, explain to you first of all, how the economy of the Greater Yellowstone is changing, and then what strategies are local communities adopting to capitalize on their wildlife resource as part of their economic development strategy. As most of you probably know, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem extends into the states of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. It's an area of approximately 18 million acres. As most of you who've studied ecology or biology, you probably know defining an ecosystem is a rather complicated process. So we've drawn it with rather fuzzy boundaries, and we did that on purpose. The Yellowstone Park has been recognized by the United Nations as a biosphere reserve. And the ecosystem itself is internationally renowned as one of the last largely intact ecosystems in the world. Of course, Yellowstone is famous for its geysers. We have about 200 geysers and 10,000 geothermal features in the park. They cover an area of about 60 miles long and 30 miles wide. In fact, it's the largest undisturbed geothermal basin in the world. The Greater Yellowstone is also known for its spectacular scenery, for its outstanding recreation opportunities, and of course, it's also known for its abundance of wildlife. It's also home to some threatened and endangered species, like the bald eagle. And it's also home to some species with very limited remaining habitat, like the trumpeter swan. It's also one of the last refuges of the grizzly bear. In fact, the only species that are no longer here since the arrival of Europeans are the black-footed ferret and the wolf. And efforts are underway to reintroduce both of these. In terms of elk, we have approximately 94,000 elk in the greater Yellowstone. They're congregated in roughly about 10 herds. Now, the important thing is 9 of these herds depend on land outside of Yellowstone National Park, primarily during the wintertime. So only one of those herds is resident inside the park all year round. To give you a feeling of the land ownership pattern, it's actually fairly complicated. We have in the middle Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, which together are about 2.6 million acres. Surrounding that are 7 different national forests. That's what you see in green. Then we have in yellow BLM land. Then we have land belonging to the Wind River Indian Reservation. And all the land that you see in white is privately owned. Now, as I was pointing out with the elk, a lot of animals wander far outside the boundary of Yellowstone National Park. So the integrity of the ecosystem depends not just on the park, but also on the proper management of the federal and private land surrounding Yellowstone Park. 2 species really exemplify this. One of them is the bison. Traditionally a wide-ranging animal that covers vast distances. If you look at how Yellowstone National Park is located, it's a high plateau. So in the wintertime, it shouldn't surprise us too much to see the animals wander outside the park to lower-lying surrounding lands in search for food. The grizzly bear is also one of those species that requires vast distances. And although scientific opinions vary, it's estimated that there's approximately 250 grizzly bears left in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Again, the bear depends on land far outside of Yellowstone. This map shows a couple of different estimates of the extent of grizzly bear range, of the extent of their habitat. Even if we use the more conservative estimate, which is the black line, we see that if we want to hang on to one of the last remnant populations of grizzly bears in the lower 48, we're going to need more than Yellowstone National Park. But it's on this land around the park, in the federal lands and the private lands, where we're having some conflicts. We have grazing. We also have sheep grazing. 4 out of the 7 national forests, for example, allow sheep grazing in critical grizzly bear habitat. Potential for conflict. About 5 million acres, everything that you see in red and orange, is open to cattle, horse, and sheep grazing. We also have oil and gas exploration. About 6.9 million acres are open to oil and gas exploration. And there are already about 200 wells have been drilled. Most of these down here in the Bridger Teton National Forest. And if you look at the number of pending or existing leases for more drilling, there are 7,400 of them lined up already to do more drilling if we get desperate enough. We also have some hard rock mining. One of the potentially more destructive developments is the potential New World mining site just 2 miles to the north of Yellowstone Park, right outside of Cook City. It's right smack in the middle of grizzly bear habitat, and it's at the headwaters of 3 tributaries to the Yellowstone River. Interestingly enough, it's also at odds, this new mining proposal, it's also at odds with the local business leaders who depend on the wild and scenic character of the land for their businesses. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on. If we look at all the mining claims in the ecosystem, there's about 12,000 of them. The big red mining carts represent more than 50 mining claims. The New World mine that I was describing is right here, just outside of Cook City. Of course, we also have some logging that goes on. This right here is the Targhee National Forest, just on the western edge of Yellowstone National Park. About 1.8 million acres in the greater Yellowstone is open to logging. We already have about 6,600 miles of logging roads, and the current plans call for an additional 900 miles of logging roads in the next 3 years. Now, these types of activities, the extraction of minerals, oil, gas, cattle grazing, sheep grazing, and logging, have in the past, and I emphasize in the past, I hope this is going to change soon with the new Perspectives program, but have in the past received a vast majority of the priority for particularly the Forest Service. If you look at their budget, last year 2 out of every 3 Forest Service dollars went towards promoting commodity extraction. Less than 1 in 6 went to promoting recreation and conservation-related activities. Now, of course, the greater Yellowstone is also heavily used for recreation. We did a survey of all 36 ranger districts, and we're trying to find out the extent of guiding and outfitting use, because there wasn't any good published information available. We found out that 2 years ago, when we finished the survey, there was over 191,000 use days, which is up about 3.5 times from 1982. And the interesting thing is, one of the area where the people that we surveyed, the area where they saw the biggest increase in demand for guiding and outfitting permits on the national forests was in non-traditional guiding and outfitting activities. In other words, activities other than hunting and fishing. Those are still very popular, but there's an additional demand on top of that for guided mountain bike tours, river rafting, wildlife viewing, and a whole variety of other commercial activities that are related to people wanting to be out into the wild lands. In terms of Yellowstone National Park itself, visitation is about 2.8 million right now. That's a 42% increase from a decade ago. So what I've given you, just briefly with those slides, is a little bit of background. And from that background, we can draw 3 conclusions at least. One of them is that the integrity of the ecosystem and its geothermal features and its water and its wildlife depends on more than just what's happening inside the boundary of Yellowstone National Park. There's a lot going on outside of Yellowstone that we need to take a very close look at. The second conclusion is that there's just a tremendous amount of pressure on the land. We've got logging and mining and cattle grazing, an absolute boom in the recreation and tourism industry. There's just a lot of people out there. In terms of one species, to give you a feel for the impact of that, about 88% of all grizzly bear mortalities in the greater Yellowstone are related to conflicts with people. So even the tourism picture isn't necessarily always a positive one from an ecological point of view. The other thing that I conclude from this is that it's a very tough situation. How do we balance, on the one hand, preserving the wild and scenic character of the greater Yellowstone, while on the other, also making use of its timber resources and its grazing resources and range and recreation opportunities? Is it possible to have a win-win situation? Can we have wildlife, clean air, grizzly bears, but also have a healthy economy at the same time? Or will the economy be at odds with the environment? Or will the environmental protection be at odds with the economy? So to answer these questions, we initiated this study to try and see what the relationship is between conservation and economic well-being. What we did, we looked at, these are pictures of counties. We looked at all 20 counties that are immediately adjacent or inside the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We looked at them from the point of view of business trends, income trends, and employment trends by industry, to try and describe for the last 20 years, where did we come from and where are we headed, and what's likely to be a good economic strategy for the future. One of the first things we noticed about the economy is that this region is following a trend very similar to the rest of the country. The industries that have been growing in the last decade have been service industries, and this means this is not just hamburger flippers and maids. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'll explain that in some detail pretty soon. We've got an increase in retail trade. A lot of that is probably related to the increase in tourism, an increase in government, finance, insurance, and real estate, wholesale trade, a little bit of increase in manufacturing. Where we've seen the big declines is in farming and ranching, in mining, and oil and gas development. Now, in terms of mining, oil, and gas development, this has been the economic picture for a lot of communities, particularly in Wyoming. Kind of a boom and bust. The reason for this is you're very dependent on international price trends for those commodities. So if this is the economic strategy for your community, to specialize and be very dependent on a mine or very dependent on some type of extractive activity, you're also, as go the international prices for that commodity, so is likely to go your community. Fortunately, this has not been the strategy for most of the communities in the greater Yellowstone. If you look at where all the new jobs have been, and we traditionally tend to think of the economy in the greater Yellowstone as being tourism, mining, logging, and ranching, we see that 94% of all new jobs in the last 20 years came from industries other than mining, manufacturing, and farming. Now, farming includes ranching, manufacturing includes the lumber and wood products sector, and mining includes oil and gas. It's pretty remarkable. This is a rural area, and it's growing. It's added over 66,000 new jobs. Most of rural America in the last 20 years has not done well. The greater Yellowstone is doing quite well. So we have to ask ourselves, who are these new industries and why are they coming here? In terms of income, 89% of all the increases in labor income have been in industries other than what has traditionally supported the area, such as mining, manufacturing, and farming. Now, an important thing to point out, these industries are still there. They should still be there. If we do things right, and if we balance our industries, these should be an important part of the economic diversity. What's important, though, is who are these folks, and why are they in the greater Yellowstone? In terms of population, if we look at the surrounding states, the state of Wyoming in the last decade lost about 2% of its population. The state of Montana lost population in the east, gained population in the west, but still didn't grow fast enough. We're going to lose one of our 2 congressional seats because we're not growing fast enough. Idaho, which because of Boise is one of the shining states in the west, one of the fastest growing states in the west, grew by about 6%. The 20 counties of the greater Yellowstone grew by 10%. So if we were a state, we'd be one of the fastest growing states in the west. One of the interesting things is when you start to compare the traditional sources of employment in this area, which is the extractive industries and farming and ranch-related businesses, you see that it's actually somewhat in decline relative to the growth in services. Over 80% of the increase in jobs has been in the service industries. Now, I said I was going to explain this a little bit. What service industries are, some of them are low-paying jobs, hamburger flippers and maids. Some of them are high-paying jobs, doctors, lawyers. We have in Bozeman 3 laser research firms. What they are is most of these are businesses that do not rely on a raw material, and they're not necessarily reliant on being in a large city. Because of advances in telecommunications, or like one guy explained it to me, FedEx and a fax machine, a lot of people can now locate their business in an area with a high quality of life. That's one of the things that the greater Yellowstone has to offer, and it's what draws new employment and new income into the region. We have about 89%, what I wanted to say about this one was that in 1969, about 24% of all the income in the region came from mining, logging, and farming. Today that's fallen to about a half. It's about 12% comes from those industries. Now when we compare the stability of the income, you see that not only have the service industries diversified the economy, they've also added stability over time. And I plotted it here against what we've traditionally relied on. So the boom and bust types of activities related to extractive uses of the land, that's one type of economic strategy, or you can rely more on attracting these service industries. We have, for example, in Bozeman, the Patagonia Mail Order Catalog Company. The factory is somewhere else, but the entire mail order crew lives in Bozeman. They do their business over the phone. Why should they be anywhere else? Another company that recently moved to Cody, they sell a liner that goes inside your tire. Extends it's kind of a liquid that you put inside the tire. And the factory is in New Jersey. All the sales folks want to be in the greater Yellowstone. There's no reason for them to be in New Jersey. So that's a lot of what we're seeing happening in the greater Yellowstone from an economic point of view. Another little interesting snippet of information is that when you look at where the employment comes from, there's two types. Wage and salary employment, which are people who work for somebody else, and proprietor's employment, the self-employed. Look how fast that's growing. To me, as an economist, that's an indication there are entrepreneurial niches. There's business opportunity in the greater Yellowstone, and people are taking advantage of it. In terms of the income, the interesting thing there is that the fastest growing sources of income are transfer payments and dividends, interest, and rent. Now, transfer payments are people who are over the age of 65 and they're earning federal retirement benefits. Dividends, interest, and rent is people who have earned their money from previous investments. They could be old-timers who've lived there for a long time, who are reaping the benefits from past investments, or they could be newcomers coming there with a nest egg. When you compare it to what traditionally supported most of the economy here, you see that these non-labor sources of income are growing steadily, and it's about 3.5 times the size of the income from mining, manufacturing, and farming-related activities combined. This is important. When you start bringing this type of information into communities who have traditionally thought of themselves as either a logging town or a mining town, and you start saying, hold on now, 40% of the income in your county is coming from these folks, suddenly you get a whole new reality, new economic strategies, also new problems related with this. The important thing is to no longer be thinking of the community that you live in the way it was maybe 20 years ago. The economy is changing, and it's constantly going to be changing. One of the things that we hear continuously, and which I want to take a look at, is specifically the role that the national forests play in the economy of the area. It's often assumed that the extractive activities that take place in the national forests, everything you see in green, that's sort of the engine that drives the economy. Something we hear in the West a lot. So let's look at the number of jobs directly produced on the national forests. And you see, the majority of them are recreation related. And then you would think to yourself, well, yes, but these are low-paying jobs. How about the multiplier effect? Not just the people who directly work in the forest, but also, let's say, the logger and then the logging supply company, or anybody in town who might indirectly depend on a paycheck from a logger or a miner or a rancher or a ski lift operator. So let's look at the direct, indirect, and induced effects. And you see that indeed, energy and minerals is higher paying. They're the highest paying jobs in the extractive sector. And recreation is relatively lower paying. Has a smaller impact on the community. But what's curious to me is let's look at all of these jobs combined. All of these jobs combined, that are all dependent on the national forests, how big a proportion is that of the region's workforce? And you find out it's about 9%. So there's a lot more going on. Most of the people in the region do not depend either directly or indirectly on somebody working in the national forests. There's an awful lot of people who live in the community and don't depend on a logging paycheck or on a ski lift operator's paycheck. There's something else going on. So let me summarize just purely from an economic point of view. What are some of the positive trends? Got an increase in service industries. Since our last recession nationwide, the one we had in about 1983, 85% of all the new jobs in this country have been in service-related businesses. Some economists prefer to call them knowledge-based businesses. For example, we have quite a few engineers who design products for their company who fax the product or send it via computer modem. The company might be in San Diego. They want to live here. So we've got an increase in these footloose types of businesses. Businesses that can pack up and move to a place with a high quality of life. An increase in transfer payments, these non-labor sources of income. There is entrepreneurial activity. There's an increase in tourism. That's a fairly obvious one for those of us who live there. And what's important is that people care where they live. And the natural and the social environment acts as an attractant for people in business. It brings them there, and it also keeps them from leaving. What are some of the negative aspects of this new growth? Well, some of it is an increased cost of living. Jackson Hole, for example, is becoming very, very hard to find a home or an apartment to live in Jackson Hole, in towns like Bozeman and Livingston and Belgrade. Also, subdivision of the rural landscape. Everybody wants a little piece of paradise. And I always use the analogy, we're like a bunch of rabbits sitting in the middle of the road looking at the oncoming headlights. We're not necessarily armed to deal with this one. Our state laws encourage subdivision of the land, and a lot of us haven't really developed the tools to prevent that from happening. We did a survey of all 20 counties, and we found out that 1/3 of all private land has already been subdivided into plots of 200 acres or less. The 200 acres or less in this region is a non-farmable size. That means eventually there's potential for cutting it up into smaller chunks. From a wildlife perspective, we all know that people like to build their homes along rivers, along riparian corridors, along the edge between meadows and woods, the same sorts of places that wildlife like to congregate in. And also we have congestion. The very thing we're running away from, we're also causing in our region. And then there's the cultural problem. And I'll just leave this slide up. I think it speaks for itself. But what I really want to talk to you about is what some communities have done. Because I think this is where we all start to learn from each other. We look at the neighbors down the street. We look at another community on the other side of the ecosystem. And we start to learn what are some of the really good strategies that we can adopt that both protect the environment but also create jobs and some community stability. This is the town of DuBois. DuBois is on the southeastern corner of the ecosystem. If you remember that map, it's about down towards here. If you were to drive from Denver to Yellowstone, you would most likely go through DuBois. In fact, you'd drive right down that road, right down there, and zip on your way to Yellowstone. Now what's interesting is this town in the 60s and 70s was very dependent on a timber mill. And what happened is they ran out of wood. The Shoshone National Forest and the Bridge of Teton National Forest were just not able to provide the amount of wood to keep the mill operating. So the mill shut down about 8 years ago. And according to some estimates, about 35% of the people in the town were dependent either directly or indirectly on income from that mill. It's a catastrophic situation for a small town. What happened though is everybody expected the town to sort of dry up and blow away. but it didn't. There were no empty stores downtown. They did some studies and they found out they were attracting retirees. 38% of the income in this county was from transfer payments and dividends, interest, and rent. They were also attracting some footloose businesses. There are some businesses that are right over here in Du Bois whose clients are at the other end of the world. Just because of the nature of telecommunications, some of these people are able to live here. So they were finding out, just like we were doing when we were doing our study on the whole ecosystem, that there's something else going on. And one of the interesting things that they found out was that what was probably attracting people and business, and what was probably keeping the tourism trade alive, had to do with the surroundings. Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, the Forest Service wanted to entertain the possibility of drilling for oil and gas 30 miles outside of town in one of the more spectacular places, a place called Brooks Lake. The town council and the city, the town council and a group called the Du Bois 2000 League both appealed that decision. They said that might have made sense 10 years ago. That economic strategy no longer makes sense for us today. So what are they doing? It hasn't been an easy adjustment. In fact, it's been pretty tough. Anytime a town loses a major employer, it's a tough adjustment. But what they found out, that they had a resource right in their backyard. And that is on Whiskey Mountain, which, let me show you the previous slide, is just outside the slide there. All of this is sheep range. In fact, one of the largest congregations of bighorn sheep is right outside the town of Du Bois. In fact, you can see the town in the distance over there. And they thought, well, how can we capitalize on our wildlife resource? And one of the things that they did is they developed a interpretive center up on the hills. And this is, you can drive to it in the fall or in the winter. And the sheep are right there. You can learn quite a bit about it. You have to hike a little bit. But they also wanted to be able to capture some of the business that might be associated with having bighorn sheep right in your backyard. They wanted to capture it from the summer tourists. So what they are developing, in fact, the groundbreaking is on the 16th, next week. They're developing a bighorn sheep interpretive center. They got funding from the Forest Service, from state and local and federal sources, the Foundation for North American Wild Sheep and the Sherritt Club, the Rocky Mountain Bighorn Society, the Wyoming Fish and Game, and also from some private donations. I don't want to get too much into the details, but it's going to be a world-class facility. There'll be all sorts of computer interactive games where you can pretend like you're the wildlife manager and you say, okay, let's get rid of the hunting season for a couple of years. There's these population dynamics models built into the computer, and the computer will spit back an answer and give you a feel for how certain management practices are going to be altering the sheep herd. This gives you a little bit of a feel for what it's going to look like on the inside. It's going to have a huge raised ceiling, a bit like we have over there right behind us, and there'll be a big mountain in it with sheep on it. Dead sheep, but sheep nonetheless. Another interesting potential development is in Cook City, Wyoming. Pardon me, Cody, Wyoming. They already have the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, which is an enormous draw. If you ever get a chance, it's a fantastic museum. They're thinking of also developing a Greater Yellowstone Interpretive Center. There's been talk about this now for about a decade. And we're, as the Wilderness Society and other conservation groups, are trying to find the funding to help serve a little bit as a catalyst to get this started. Now, here we have towns like Cody and Du Bois developing interpretive centers. It's a good strategy for the town. Why? Well, because first of all, the Park Service can't afford it, to be blunt. In the last 10 years, the visitation in Yellowstone has gone up by 1 million people. If you look at their budget, in real dollars, it's gone up by 10,000. Only 6%, or less than 6%, of their budget is spent on interpretive programs. That creates an enormous opportunity for the towns of the Greater Yellowstone to fill that niche. If they do a good job, they can do nature interpretation for people on their way to Yellowstone and explain to them what they're about to see or what they can see just outside of town. Not only that, if we develop interpretive center throughout the Greater Yellowstone, what happens is that mom and pop, as they're driving into the park with the kids with the station wagon, they're going to spend 5 days in Yellowstone. When they find these interpretive centers in the outskirts of the ecosystem, they'll realize, first of all, they're not entering Yellowstone, they're entering the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So you gain a bit more of a knowledge and understanding of the concepts of ecosystems. You get a little bit more understanding of why it's important to protect ecosystems. Just want to run through a few more examples. Ricks College in Rexburg, Idaho, has developed a guide and outfitting program, a series of courses that you can take and become a certified guide and outfitter. What's special about this program is that they focus a lot on non-consumptive uses of the land. In fact, they pride themselves that you can go and follow where they were the previous week, and they say, we dare you to identify where we can't. That's the sort of thing that's happening within the guiding and outfitting industry. They're starting to realize that there's a real opportunity for wildlife viewing, and it's good for this community. It helps bring people in who stay at Ricks College in the summertime. Ricks College, this town, interestingly enough, has another interesting strategy that they're doing. The college, they found out that there was a lot of people moving to the Greater Yellowstone with some money to spend. A lot of them were retirees. What they did, the dorms are empty in the summertime. So what they do is they go down to Arizona and they recruit sunbirds, retired people who want to escape the heat of Arizona in the summertime, and they get them to live in the dorms, 1,500 of them every year. So it's a significant boost to the community. They're non-consumptive users. They're there to visit, to watch, to enjoy, and then they leave. There's quite a bit going on. I've seen some real change in the last 2 years. Communities are starting to address the issue of planning for their future and trying to figure out how nature plays a role in the quality of life and in stimulating the economy. Recently, the citizens of Teton Valley held a community gathering and a workshop. And the purpose of the workshop was to find out, what is it that the community values? What is it that's threatening those values, and how are they going to protect those values? This is what they identified. Most important were clean air and water, the agricultural setting, the view of the mountains, proximity to public lands, and the proximity to wildlife. So here we have a community that's going to be developing a strategy to protect those values. Similar efforts are also underway in Idaho Falls and in Livingston, in Red Lodge, in Cook City and Gardner. Here's an example, and some of these were available up at the front desk yesterday. I don't know if there's still any left, but this is the Idaho Falls Post-Register. And they developed a special series for their newspaper on the Greater Yellowstone. And they explain in here what is an ecosystem, and they talk about lumber mills, what are they going to have to do to survive. They talk about geothermal features. Last time I spoke with them, they were going to circulate this to all the junior highs and high schools in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And they recently received an award for it as well. Just a few weeks ago, I finished a survey that I conducted through the Survey Research Center at Montana State. What we were after, and it might seem kind of obvious now after you've heard me talk about this, but we actually wanted to quantify why people and businesses are coming to the Greater Yellowstone. I mean, we know this intuitively. We know it. We've got tons of examples of it. But we were trying to address a gap in the traditional business location literature, which would predict that the reasons people move to a certain area has to do with wages and availability of labor and capital. What we actually found out was that labor and capital and availability of labor ranked very low in importance. The highest ranking reasons why people decided to put a business in the region was because of the rural nature, the low crime rate, the proximity to public lands, and the proximity to wildlife-based recreation. When we asked them if they would be more profitable if they were located in an urban area, 2 out of 3 respondents said yes. So they're coming there even though it's not necessarily the most profitable thing to do. So much for classical economic theory that everybody does things for profit motive. And when we asked them, all things considered, would you choose to locate a business in this region again? 86% of them said yes, mostly for lifestyle reasons. The ones that said no said it had to do mostly with the local tax structure. Particularly in Montana, we have a horrendous workman's comp tax. So in summary, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's in transition. But it's a transition in which the environment plays a critical role. First of all, the environment is important for local residents. From a community development point of view, one of the most important things is to keep local people and businesses from leaving. Most of rural America has not been able to do this. Greater Yellowstone excels in doing that. The outstanding fishing and the hunting opportunities, the watchable wildlife, the character of the region, these are all important for the quality of life for local residents. But it's also important for business. The wildlands and the wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone, they attract business. It's the single best business strategy for the Greater Yellowstone is to protect the environment. So we don't have this horrible trade-off between the environment and economics. What we need to realize is that the economy, just like an ecological system, is constantly changing. It's never static, it's always dynamic. For the residents of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, they can develop economic strategies as long as they're aware of the changing global economy that they're in. The best strategy right now seems to be an ecological protection. But this changing economy is also going to call for some changing policies of the federal land management agencies so that they be in sync with what's happening in the economy. Now, a lot of communities in the Greater Yellowstone have already taken the lead in capitalizing on their wildlife and their wildlands resources. And it makes sense from an ecological point of view, and it also makes sense from an economic point of view. That's all I have. Thanks, and I think we got time for questions.